I remember in a single night seeing northern lights and phosphorescence at the same time in
Mm,
Alaska.
wow.
And, we'd be away from land for a really long time, so there was no light pollution to show what was sky and what was the ocean.
Mhm.
It was felt like you were in outer space.
Hmm.
But the same night, I remember the guys got drunk and knocked each other out, so I think that was like a pretty standard sample of the spectrum of fishing. Like a huge brawl and the most beautiful thing you could imagine.
That's Kylie Manning. I'm Jamie Brisick, and this is Soundings, brought to you by the Surfer's Journal. The Journal is a member-supported publication made possible by sponsorship from FCS, Finisterre, Howler Brothers, Outerknown, Patagonia, Rainbow Sandals, Vans, and Yeti. More like a book than a magazine, the Journal delivers 136 pages of independent storytelling every 8 weeks, covering the people, culture, travel, and art of surfing. To learn more and to subscribe, please visit surfersjournal.com. This episode of Soundings is presented by Costa Sunglasses. If you're anything like me and you spend lots of time around the water, then you know just how important it is to have a good pair of shades. And since 1983, when a group of intrepid outdoorsmen set out to make sunglasses that could stand up to the harsh environments they regularly encountered, Costa remains the choice in eyewear among those committed to life on the water. So whether you're diving in, climbing aboard, suiting up, sliding one, leaning back, or all the above, head to costadelmar.com to grab your pair and to see what's out there. Kylie Manning is a painter, surfer, fisher, and mother based in Brooklyn, New York. Kylie's parents were both art teachers, and while she was growing up, the family moved between their home in Juneau, Alaska, to various regions in Mexico, which would inform her artwork and her surfing. Kylie is a graduate of Mount Holyoke College, Massachusetts, with a double major in philosophy and visual arts. While she was getting her MFA at the New York Academy of Art, she had a captain's license to operate 500-ton commercial fishing boats on international waters and spent her summers catching salmon on the Pacific coast. Kylie has gained global respect for her abstract figurative paintings, which embody powerful yet delicate compositions with brush strokes that seem to be in motion. Kylie's work is held in numerous collections worldwide, including the Columbus Museum of Art, Ohio, Institute of Contemporary Art, Miami, Florida, and the X and U's museums in China. Recently, she collaborated with the choreographer Christopher Wheeldon for the New York City Ballet piece, From You Within Me. It's a glorious thing, the dancers interfacing with Kylie's large-scale paintings in a manner that suggests surfer and wave. Kylie, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. I am such a big fan and I'm so excited to be here. So I really appreciate it.
Well, we feel likewise. I think a starting point might be, you grew up in Alaska with Mexico figuring largely into your upbringing, and then surfing, fishing, art making. Can you talk a little bit about your upbringing?
Yeah. So, I think it really started with my folks. My dad was a surfer, and I think his first board was like a Greg Knoll in like 62, 63. And he was like 12 or 13 and surfed all through the 60s. And so my folks moved up to Alaska before I was born. And so we were raised halfway between Alaska and Mexico because they were teachers and I think surfers. They just kind of wanted us to be raised outside of one cultural perspective. So we would bounce around between the two, and they would just kind of set up this van, and they drove us down through California, down into Baja, and then for quite a long time down in Puerto Escondido, and then eventually up in San Blas and around Sayulita later. So we were kind of all around the coasts of Mexico, just sort of chasing waves when we were really, really little kids. And then we'd go back to Alaska every year. So I'd go up and I was always swimming and springboard diving and ended up commercial fishing to pay for school and all that. So, yeah, I was just sort of on the water and around the water whenever I wasn't painting.
What about the relationship between being in the water, having somewhat of an itinerant upbringing, and then making work and looking at your work? There's a real sense of movement.
Yeah, I think that they have what started with like a way to help me financially pay for school and things like that with commercial fishing was just that I ended up developing sea legs, I think, in sort of every aspect of my life. So the paintings now all have this sense of ebb and flow and like a tidal conversation, and a thing that I just have always kind of affiliated with weather in general. Like I think that if I can capture a really specific time of day or knot of wind or latitude, then the mark making can be really radical because the viewer will know exactly what it feels like to be on that coast at that time.
Mhm.
Um, so that was always the goal, is if I could capture a really, really specific atmosphere, then I could be a little bit outside of a specific narrative and a little bit more abstract. And that all comes from this time on the water and knowing how to read water and learn about the surface versus what's underneath the surface, and this sense of I don't know, this kind of like distillation process that I think is in the painting in every single aspect, in the way it's made and what it's about as well.
Mhm. And with your parents as teachers, when you were growing up, and they were art teachers, if I
Yeah, my mom taught First Nations weaving, and she did a lot of like work with leather, and my dad taught traditional like sculpture and drawing and painting. So I actually made my first surfboard in 8th grade in, like, one of their classes, you know? It was like it was my first board, but it was a pretty good board. They got some planks, and we were in my dad's sculpture studio, and I was like, I don't know, whatever age you are in 8th grade, but, shaping my first board in a sculpture class, and we got to call it a sculpture.
Wow, that's so cool. And did you paint it as well?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. Yeah, I did. Yeah, so we'd be down in Mexico, and then we'd go back up to Alaska, and yeah, I think that aspect of thinking about being in the water was just a part of both of those places because they were both fishing towns. So if it was surfing Yakutat or surfing San Blas, it was just sort of around.
Mhm. It's
Yeah.
fascinating because I think of them as extreme, maybe opposites is the wrong word, but I mean, they seem at opposite poles in terms of Alaska being cold and way up in the north, and Mexico being warm and warm light, kind of washed in warm light.
Yeah. They have different vibes, but I think they completed one another, you know? I think that there's things that are missing in Alaska that you get in Mexico, like vitamin D.
Yeah.
But, there's also things that you only get in Alaska, for sure. But there's so many similarities with, I think just coastal towns
Mhm.
and the towns that are, you know, under a certain amount of population and a proximity to the mountains and to the nature. So whether or not it was a jungle or a temperate rainforest, we were just in nature all the time.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
And coming to your style as an artist, was that something that happened young? Was it something that happened when you were in college?
My style, I was just giving a talk back at the where I went to my graduate program. And so I kind of did this deep dive, and it was always there. It was always this really smack dab in the middle between gesturation and information, and getting a little bit lost in that too. I think starting with an image that I hope to I guess unravel in the piece, and then getting really impatient and letting it just carry itself in its own direction.
Mhm.
And I think that the amount of how much I try to portray versus leave up to the viewer, that's always been in a really, really similar spot since I was a little kid. And yeah, I think there's always like one or two works from every year that I'm like, that one had really that thing, that little piece of magic that I'm still searching for now.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Is there a piece or a project you're most proud of?
This last one was pretty special because I was invited by this beautiful museum called Space K Museum in Seoul. And I worked with this really incredible choreographer, and she worked really hard to capture, I think, all of the things that I consider the weather in the piece. A lot of choreographers have understood as musicality, and
Hmm.
they've seen this sense of what I think of a ebb and flow or like a flotsam and a jetsam. They see as crescendos and tempo, um, and they created a brand new piece of music for it. And it was this massive installation with God, it must have been 60 feet wide or something. And people could walk through these silk veils and sort of feel their way through a painting so that they were seeing a painting from the inside out
Hmm.
rather than this objective conversation of feeling uncomfortable in a museum. They really, I think it really broke that down. And that was something that I really think is um, a part of being in nature and a part of this sense of if I can capture something that gives us this sense of awe, that's the closest thing that I can think of to this feeling of being in the water. And
Hmm.
so the choreographer really captured that. The space captured that. We built this massive kind of this arch and all this fishing rigging to hang all the silk veils from. So it really felt like you were looking at the hull of a ship from underneath the water.
Hmm.
And I think that that just brought forward this conversation of what can feel massive and powerful and also silent and delicate at the same time. And
Hmm.
that was something that I was so proud of with the New York City Ballet and was so proud of with this last collaboration as well. And I
Hmm.
think that there's something about the dance world really understanding that in the paintings in a way that's brought something that's helped viewers understand what I've been trying to get at for a long time. So that
Hmm.
was really I was really proud of both of those projects.
Hmm. I, I
Yeah.
I spent time online, I should say, with the piece you did with the New York City Ballet. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so that was God, that was just a dream come true. So a good friend of mine, who actually wrote the piece for the Surfer's Journal, his name is Tristan McAllister. He's a extraordinary writer and just has this really unique brain. He told this like world-renowned choreographer about the show in LA. And I invited everybody from the Surfers Journal to come and see it. And it was just a joy to share that show with everybody in LA in particular. And this choreographer came and saw it, and he said he really got lost in this sense of abandon and wildness. And he wanted to create a brand new ballet. He wanted to create a brand new ballet from within that world. So it wasn't just about doing backdrops or costumes, it was about forming a new ballet that was, not an artist statement for the paintings, but something that was born within this world of painting that I've been trying to create for decades. And he was a principal dancer for the New York City Ballet for forever before he became a choreographer, and so he has this similar thing that I do, which is within this really vigorous academic training and this specific skill set, only through that can you really be like riffing, or I guess it'd be like jazz or something like
Hmm.
that. And I think it's you might understand it as a surfer, like somebody. It's only when they're extraordinary that when you watch them play, is it beautiful,
Hmm.
And so a choreographer at that level trying to break down the sections of the paintings that are really academic versus the sections that are really free and truly abstract, truly wild. Um, he captured this undulation and this swirling chaos that I think feels like being in a storm.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it feels both how we understand it internally, but also as any waterman would understand, to see that and know that sense of turmoil that we can recognize in nature, we know it from inside out.
Yes.
So that was just incredible. It's gonna be they're gonna restage it, and it will be the first time I've seen it in a couple of years, and I'm just so excited. It's by this extraordinary composer named Arnold Schoenberg,
Mm-hmm.
and this sextet is just crazy. It's really really exciting.
I listened, I watched, I was fascinated, and it's interesting that you should have started the description with surfing in the Surface Journal, because my take, and it's something we've probably all thought about, which is, surfing being akin to ballet and the dance side of it. And in seeing sort of your large scale works behind the dancers, the ballet dancers, there is really almost like surfer on wave, and the wave being your painting in some way, the interpretation and the sort of reciprocity of the two.
Absolutely. I think there is, I'm so happy that you feel that. I think that there is something with the way that we remember things on the ocean that is in outside of time just a little bit, where if you see a surfer carving lines,
Mm-hmm.
it freezes into your like retina in
Mm-hmm.
this way that's a little bit like watching a whale breach. Like that's only a second, but in your brain it takes up minutes,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there's this thing that breaks down our understanding of time, like a Muybridge photography or something, where you freeze it in your brain. And great choreography can do that as well. You see these lines, you see these carving of lines that I think are really related to dance and movement. And it makes you think about what makes, what you can see it in a surfer. You can see who they are in their life, how they treat people by the way they surf. You can see the way that people move and the way that they dance, and if they're confident or insecure, or like all of these things you can just see in the lines that we form.
Mm-hmm.
And it's I think it I think it really highlights what the difference between bravery and bravado is. And I think a good surfer can see that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you spent a lot of time at sea. As I understand it, you have a captain's license and you've been a commercial fisher.
Yeah, yeah. I it's so funny. I never don't hear fisherman. It's funny. You're
I think it's the gender neutral way of referring to.
right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think I still even write fisherman. Yeah. I it was just a natural fit. I was a athlete when I was young, and
What kind of athlete?
I mean, everything. I grew up surfing all the time, and every time I was like good enough to be competitive, we'd go back to Alaska and I'd snowboard, or I was a competitive swimmer and springboard diver, and competed all around for all those things. So it was always just this, diving also has that sense of forming a line, and this instantaneous thing. But so I the match of fishing for me was just a really easy fit. And I always knew I wanted to be a painter, but I had no connection to the art world. My folks being art teachers in Alaska, I loved art history and I loved art books, but I didn't have any connections. So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I would go back in commercial seine, which is this really specific type of fishing for salmon in the summertime. And then I would go to back to art school or go on a residency in Pain in Germany, and for like 10 months at a time. And then I'd go back and fish for the summer. And it would be 3 or 4 months. And I got my captain's license for these 500-ton vessels when I was, I don't know, in my early 20s, just so I could sort of make that position as a mariner unquestionable. It was really, really competitive and really difficult as a woman to get on a boat.
Mm-hmm.
And so to get that license was a big help. But yeah, in the end, I still just had to walk the docks and get a gig.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember this. There's so many fishing stories, but I remember getting my license in this small East Coast fishing town outside of on the coast of Massachusetts. And I was in this class with all these guys, who were studying sonar and navigation and all this stuff. And in the beginning of the class, this was a long time ago, but everybody was pretty irritated that I was there. And I can't do the accent at all, but I'll never forget these guys. They were like, these fucking chicks with their gym shorts and their flip-flops and their tank tops. That's the only reason they need to be on a boat. Like, you got to get out of this class. And then in the
Wow.
end, I was taking the test, and the Navy guys run the tests. And I finished my test, and I turned it in, and the Navy guy was like, you gotta, like, there's no way you could be done right now. You gotta, like, you cheated. You cheated. And all the guys that had originally been, like, pretty pissed at me for being in the class, they started to, like, kind of realize what was going on, and they started, like, whispering and getting kinda, like, pissed, and then they all started yelling at the Navy guy, and they were like, "She knows her shit. She knows her shit. She didn't cheat. She didn't cheat." So it's the same guys that were like, I feel like I've got that story, of a version of that story, a million times, of the same crew in the lineup or something, that you eventually proved yourself over, and then they were very, very loyal in the end, and
Right.
yelling at the Navy guy that I would have never have cheated, and that I knew my stuff. So I don't think I would have been able to pass the test if they weren't yelling at him. But yeah, fishing was crazy. It was beautiful and strange. It was a very specific community. I remember in a single night seeing northern lights and phosphorescence at the same time in Alaska.
Wow.
And we would be away from land for a really long time, so there was no light pollution to show what was sky and what was the ocean. It was felt like you were in outer space. But the same night, I remember the guys got drunk and knocked each other out, so I think that was like a pretty standard sample of the spectrum of fishing. Like a
Yeah.
huge brawl and the most beautiful thing you could imagine
Right.
within like an hour.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. What was it like kind of navigating that sort of primarily male world as a woman?
That I think is something I've never had. I've had a lot of trials, but with fishing, it was so apparent, and I think with sports and skill is really apparent. For me, the issue is when there's an unconscious bias versus a conscious bias. If you can't prove something, so like the biases in culture in general, I think, are quite a bit more difficult for me than in a situation like fishing. That having been said, yeah, there were definitely times where it was like hairy and dicey and close. We used to have to hide that I was a woman on the boats sometimes if other boats were around, and sometimes you'd do a competitive, like they'd shoot off a gun at like 3 a.m. and all these boats would race if we knew that fish were kind of coming back to land in a certain spot, and so we'd have to hide like my braids and stuff like that. So I'd be under all the gear, and there's so much in your scrubs. It's so little. It's not obvious, but one of my braids fell out in another boat. Somebody saw that there was a woman on one of the boats, and they started like yelling about it on the radio. And then these boats started like all charging at us. And the guys, like, I remember the rigging entangled because we were still competing for fish, and they were trying to get on the boat. And they like ripped off their clothes and were just like beating their chests like gorillas. Not to
Jeez.
like, we didn't stop fishing or anything like that. I think it was just sort of to like be like, what the fuck do you think you're doing here? I think was the thing.
No
And
kidding.
that, yeah, I mean, I was the only one for a long time. And now there's more, I think it's like anything on the water. It's not irregular anymore. But yeah, there was a few things that were like spooky and close calls and stuff like that. And there was it was fishing a long time ago. There was a lot of drugs. You'd have to, like, people would work for days and days at a time. It wasn't people at their best, but there was also things that were like extraordinarily beautiful. Like, you couldn't even wrap your mind around how beautiful it was. And watching the storms come and go and change, and all of that was amazing. But yeah, it was real deal stuff out on the ocean for a long time, and people sometimes not at their best. Um, but I think I feel that way in the lineup sometimes too. If I'm surfing and people have a weird vibe, it's hard to like out macho somebody that's like twice as big as you. Like there's a
Mhm,
little bit
mhm,
of like not backing down, but there's also the part of you that's like, well, I, I actually don't. I actually am intimidated. I actually can't win.
mhm.
So, there is a bit of that that's like, but yeah, I'll often go and surf a break that's less populated just to get some more waves to myself. Yeah.
Mhm, mhm. On the fishing note, what was the wildest, heaviest, or most flavorful for our listeners story that at sea?
Well, there was great catches. There was times that we almost tipped the boat over that we had so many fish. I mean, in the seine vessel, you lift them over the side. So I think I sent you one of those pictures that the bag of fish was extraordinary. It was you're looking at a year's worth of income in a load. It was amazing, and
Mhm.
but there was so many storms that year. That was the year with that story with the rope that I was talking a little bit about on.
Tell me about this one. I think our listeners would love to hear the
Yeah,
rope story.
that was crazy. So there's this weird machine called a wench, and it you tie these 8-inch thick ropes around it, and they're filled with plastic coatings, and then it's wire. So it's a rope that's built out of like millions of wires, and it's all braided together, so they're really powerful. But as the wench is so strong, if you're rafting up to another boat, and the tide was so crazy and the wind was so crazy that the boats would push and clank and crash against each other, and then the rope would take too much pressure. And even on the wench, if you're loosening it up and trying to be quite conscientious of how quickly that the boats are going to drop next to one another, it's still just pulled too tight. And it was this huge, huge storm, and we'd been fishing for days, and I remember hearing a gunshot from, like, 5 miles away, and then this child scream, and it was like, I still remember it. It was like I had heard it from, like, 5 miles away, and then, I was sort of in a daze, and I was kinda walking around in circles, and I still had the rope in one hand, or what was left of the rope, and one of the guys just picked me up and threw me down in the galley. And what I found out much later was that the gunshot was the rope exploding on me, and I'll send
Wow.
you the picture because the whole right side of my body was welted and then later, like, black with bruises, and, the scream of the child was me. But I just, like,
Wow.
had a complete outer body, like, disassociation, and then
Uh-huh.
I was walking around in circles on the deck in a storm with, like, the remains of a rope, I guess. And this was just how it was told to me, so I don't like any good fisherman, I blacked out completely and don't remember any of it.
Mm.
But, yeah, and then this guy just had to throw me down in the galley and then came to and had some I don't know, maybe a shot of tequila and some aspirin or something and go back to work was really generally the solution.
No, it's interesting because I was thinking about, I think I read somewhere in my research of you, being a fan of the painter Turner,
Yeah,
and I too am
yeah.
a fan of Turner, and Turner famously strapped himself to the mast to kind of better understand, being in rough seas and the movement of the ocean and storms, etcetera, but it sounds like you kinda got that education, organically.
Yeah, yeah, I think, yeah, I didn't have to do any theater for it. I definitely, um, got a serious upbringing with that, but yeah, I mean, those Turner paintings and those Homer paintings, I mean, they're just so incredible, this sense of, tumultuousness and chaos within that refined hand that they have. It was really fun to see, and I grew up, reading all about those guys and being on the water, and, yeah, I have tons of influences of artists that were, inspired by the ocean for sure.
So, here's a vaguely cynical question. Did navigating the world of, you know, commercial fisher people, prepare you for navigating the art world?
I think that, well, I started to talk about it a little bit before. There are biases in all culture, and therefore in the art world, it's reflected, and it's definitely one of these things that I think you see with surfing, that even though we're trying to get better, there's still nothing even close to an understanding of women at the same level of men. I mean, if you look at the top 10 auction sales every year, or, um, you know, the museums, or, all of these things, uh, there's change, but it's not enough change, and um, it's not real enough. Some of it's superfluous and for show, and it needs to be ingrained in a much deeper way. And I think that so that's the issue. Is with fishing, the biases were so clear. With culture, the biases are really unconscious. So we have to figure out and kind of
Hmm.
unlock those things. And that's where things like what you're doing with Westerly Wendina, and sort of exploring our unconscious in a way that's a little bit more ontological, and something that the kids and the next generation are completely throwing gender away in a way that's like so overdue. And we don't even have a chance to
Hmm.
start to
Hmm.
see and learn the ways that you know we um prioritize, and all of that. And I think that people talk about grit as this special thing that makes people great. But if you look at, like any plant, if it's given sunshine and water, it will grow. And when you think about the way that male artists in the past were given so much, that everything that they did was unquestionable, it provided this space of sheer confidence, um, and an unquestionable, I don't know, just belief in what they were doing, that we don't even know how to begin to unlock that yet. But I do think, for me in particular, I have found an amazing gallery and work with amazing people that's chock full of brilliant, strong women. And I just always raft up to that and find that and make that space, and find artists and people that think about this stuff and care about it in a more open way. And that's where the grit comes in handy, where I think there's this thing that's like, if you work harder than everyone, you'll it's
Hmm.
gonna pay off eventually. And you can see that in who becomes the best at surfer, who becomes the best fisherman, who becomes the best, like this uh undeniable work ethic, I think. I hope if it counts for
Yeah.
counts for something. And that's where they all braid in together a lot. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah, I relate to that, and I think there's that strong work ethic. There's a thing where the work becomes its own reward, and the work almost shields you from the questions of sort of hierarchy, status, etc. All so much of what like defines one's career. It's like if your head's in the work, none of that matters in that moment. It's almost like a escape and transcendence from all that stuff.
Completely, completely. And I think, I mean, painting is such an archival medium that I'm making these paintings for hundreds of years from now, where who knows where culture will be and how we can look at things. I mean, we just
Hmm.
found this new research on, not we, they just found this new research on Vermeer, that they believed that, it sounds like it's unquestionable now that some of the works that we've considered the ultimate master were done by his teenage daughter. And so
Mm.
there's this huge reckoning of where people placed value, with this idea of a true master of the field, and that some of those works were done by Maria, who was in her teens. So it's pretty exciting, and
Hmm.
this stuff over time, that's where Turner and all of these people were in conversation with things completely outside of this time frame, and maybe 1,000 years from now, people will look at these paintings next to Turner's and see them holding hands together conceptually. And that would be, that's the dream, I think. Do you think
Mhm.
about that? Because it seems like you've done so many things that it's almost like you're a curator now. And I think curators in the art world feel a really weighty sense of duty with where they shine their light because it's kind of writing history.
Mhm.
And you,
Mhm.
as a filmmaker and as a writer, and having such a sense of the surf culture, what stories you tell go forward. Do you feel a sense of that,
Mhm.
I guess, archiving duty or like a pressure?
You presented in a romantic light. No, in many ways it's just very selfish. I just
Yeah.
I follow the things that interest
Yeah.
me, and I've been doing it now for a long time. And I guess there are through lines, and there's how do I say? No, I wish I felt that. I don't. I kind of come with the imposter syndrome, outsider complex, etc. And I've just
Still?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I come at it really with just trying to survive and kind of maintain the sometimes wonderful, sometimes challenging life that I've made for myself that I didn't know what it was.
Do you see it, do you see a parallel with it's not just stories about, surfing, but do you see a parallel in the way that you write connected to how you surf?
Yeah, for sure. In fact, I think of there's almost it's interesting that word lines, and it's used in surfing, skateboarding, snowboarding, um, and I guess there is that sense of sort of interpretation and improvisation. But when I was first expanding from surfing into writing, it truly did feel like it was almost like an extension of one into the other. Like one was done physically on a board, and the other was done with my pen across a a, a, a notebook page. But yeah, and this is for you being a surfer and then making work and painting. Do you see like is there a kind of borderless crossing of going from
For
one into the
sure.
other?
Yeah, I mean, you probably heard it the way I talk about it. If you ask about fishing, I talk about surfing. If you ask about painting, I talk about fishing. It's just a
Yeah.
swirl together for me. And actually the least refined mode of communication for me is talking. So the way that I
Mhm.
try to express this stuff is through the paintings and when they're really successful, I think there's an element that's like a haiku where I've washed out everything that's unnecessary and what remains is the least amount of information that's sharing the most.
Mhm.
But also other times it's like I can see it with your writing and like a poem that is stumbling and finding words and sometimes the words are excess and you remove them, but there's this slowing down and speeding
Mhm.
up of language that yeah, for sure crosses with dance and weather and music.
Mhm.
And I think that's just a part of it. Wait, tell me about Mansplainers Anonymous.
Oh, mansplaining is actually apropos to what was gonna be my next question. Mansplainers Anonymous was a poem I'd written, and I was imagining kind of like a 12-step group sitting in folding chairs in a circle, and it was a bunch of guys who had the habit of explaining too much. Um, but that is so perfect that you should ask about that because I remember talking to William Finnegan years ago, and I think it was for the Surfer's Journal, and we were talking about writing, and we were talking about the finding the kind of balance between giving the reader enough
Mm.
information so that they're following along, but not over explaining things. And I often will read something and think, well, I will often read something and feel like it's insulting the intelligence of the viewer and explaining too much. And when I read something that kind of complements and assumes the reader can make the leaps and connect, I enjoy that very much. And that's very much the type of writing I'm drawn to. Your paintings, on that note, really, to my mind, I feel like they complement the viewer in the sense of there's a sort of figurative abstraction that's not giving too many pieces, and allows the viewer to really um, finish, if you will, or interpret and come to their own conclusions on what there is to think about.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. That means a lot. It's important to me. I think it comes back from because my folks were art teachers. I always felt comfortable in every single gallery and every single museum. But I also, we would have literally be in a van up and down the coast of Baja with and only had tents. So it wasn't about having things. It was feeling that our perspective belonged. And so I think I always have just tons of faith in the viewer that their perspective is valid and full and belongs. And because of that, and I think it's really common in US contemporary figuration where they try to set up a narrative. And for me, that's um, just not specific. Like, it's just not interesting to maintain that narrative the whole time. So I try so hard to create a sense of logic and then break it and trust that the
Mhm.
viewer understands and has enough information to understand and have faith in the painting that when something is missing, it was a decision. And then you start to question
Mhm.
why. And that I also think because painting is outside of language, that anything that you do to make it not open to interpretation needs to be there for a really specific reason because you're eliminating people. And so
Mhm.
oftentimes I'll kind of collage together different genders or different backgrounds so that it feels like everyone can understand and feel like they're a part of art history in a way that they haven't been given space to before. And so it makes for the way that the figures interact to be a lot more open-ended so that the way that the viewer
Mhm.
interprets it will change the narrative for each viewer.
When you're working and when you're making a painting, can you kind of describe a little bit of that process? And I'm sure that's very difficult, but I will say this. I'm so fascinated by sort of creative process, and I think it's one of these things that is often difficult to explain, describe, etc. But where do you start and then where do you end?
Well, I think people try to make paintings sound very mysterious because I think sometimes people are trying to sell a little bit of smoke. And
Hmm.
uh, the real thing is that you don't get good at something unless you don't just stumble upon being a good draftsman. That takes decades and decades and decades. You don't just we have a sophisticated communal eye because of film and the great color involved in film, but color theory takes years of understanding how it is wiggly and sticky and manipulative and all of these things that you have to sit and figure it out in the paintings. So explaining how they happen is quite simple. I work with a Belgian linen, and I use a very traditional medium called rabbit skin glue, which is this like little a crystal that like Caravaggio used to size the canvases and make them as tight as a drum. And then I use this really broad, like a palette knife, to use this oil ground to kind of create this sheer white weathering of the piece already. So I'm sanding and grinding and learning the weave of every single linen before I even start. And then I'll start with these washes and these rollers. And through those, I start to find the landscape. Then within the landscape, figures will emerge, kind of the way that people talk about sculpture. Something will come out of within itself. Once I start to find those bodies in the nature, in the paintings, I'll look back to old family photos for references or references from everywhere to sort of find a little bit of the contrapposto or the weight of the figure. And I'll let some sketching come in and play. But if it starts to over articulate itself, I'll lay it down on the ground and pour pigment over the top of it. And that's where it starts to get really exciting, which is the quantity of oils versus thinners will push the tone inside of it. So
Mhm.
where I do an exhibition, I'll study the geology and let some of that, like the literal earth. I can show you stones from the last exhibition in Korea, and I'll grind them into these pigments so that, I mean, you can see behind me the washing will push the tone in one direction or another, and it works like a literal tide to cover and hide, and everything that's underneath that turns into these ghosts and these souls that fill up past lives of the painting, so that it feels like it's full of loss and full of joy and experiences of lives that filled up the piece, but that are not necessarily left in the final layer.
Wow, that's so beautiful. What is an average workday like for you?
Well, I've got a little one, so I get to spend the morning with her, and then I get here, and I usually about 8 to 10 hours a day, starting with stretching and stuff like that with these canvases to kind of get myself warmed up. I stare at the works for a long time, and I try to work on paintings that are different degrees of finished so that I can bring the excitement through every single layer. So I don't do one, finish it, and do a next. I work on like an entire family of paintings so that the momentum of the first wash and first hit, that will often solve the solution of a piece that's almost done. You can see in a painting when somebody slows down or they get a little cowardly or get nervous, and the piece kind of becomes lethargic and anxious or nervous. And so that's my way to sort of paddle through so that it keeps the speed and keeps the same intention all the way through.
Growing up in Alaska and Mexico and kind of with a lot of ocean, with a lot of open space, what living in New York is very different to that.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I was starting to say it earlier. I still think that some of the closest thing we can get here is seeing great art. There's something like going to the Met and seeing, your piece that feels like, you know, traversing a mountain, or feels like being away from land on the ocean. There's something. It's not the same. It's not a spiritual experience. It's something that art taps into. Great art taps into, that I think is a real goal. What we lack in New York in landscape, we make up for in culture and in the arts. And
Mhm.
I think seeing great art gives us s- something like alongside that feeling. But yeah, New
Mhm.
York's very different. Sneaking out to the Rockaways and finding needles in the beach. That's not San Blas. It's the best
Yes.
we got. It's the best we can do. But it's you're right by the airport, but I've had amazing experiences there too. So it's just different. I think you have to set up cocoons and like sanctuaries in New York. My studio feels like a real sanctuary to
Mhm.
protect yourself here in a way that, because the city
Mhm.
can wear you down, and you have to go kind of
Yes.
like go back to the ocean to fill yourself back up.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I felt that I lived in New York for about 11 years, and it was it was a lot of work to kind of give up my surf addiction, ocean addiction. But what I did find, and this was obviously like pending the weather because there were days when it was impossible to do this, but I would sometimes go for walks. And I came to realize that kind of what like New York City lacks in nature in the traditional sense, you can get it in the kind of beating hearts of human beings all around you. And being, I actually just loved being in the crowds, which would seem like the open vistas of the ocean and pondering the horizon line is this kind of quiet solitude, and it's not claustrophobic, but the actual claustrophobia of bodies almost like gave me that experience in some way.
Do you dance? Do you ever when you were young, did you go out and dance?
I unfortunately was one of those people through their teens that thought dancing was like I was too cool for it, and then
Oh.
I regret that horribly, and then I've made up for it by dancing terribly in recent years.
Yeah, it
But I do
seems
dance.
like that would be your space.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it is most Alaskans I know are pretty claustrophobic. So, I think also as an artist, it's a part of your job to be really tapped in. So when it's going well, being in crowds, being connected to everybody is a great thing. But often I end up picking up and carrying the weight of other people's negativity in a way that I find very burdensome and something that takes me a long time to like undo. Like even my walk to the studio, I just feel all the things that everybody's feeling around me, and so it takes me a little bit of time to kind of like flush that out. Um,
Mhm.
but I've also definitely I've shown up at the ocean feeling like I was wrung out and had nothing else to give, and then kind of refilled it there. But it's funny, it's
Mhm.
interesting to me that you can refill that in crowds. I can't fathom.
Mhm.
That's very foreign to me, that idea.
Yeah, I guess, it's just a kind of, I don't know, curiosity, or maybe like what we now know of as sort of oxytocin that
Yeah.
comes through eye contact. But I guess my point with all that is that when I moved to New York, I thought I was getting as far from sort of surfing as possible. And in some ways it was, but I think I sort of found my, like as a lifelong surfer, I kind of found my proxies, and ways to just sort of survive and not have this sort of withdrawal symptoms
How did you
take me
do it?
down.
How did you do it?
I think like truly in the right seasons, spring and fall best, and summer it would be hot. Winter would often be rainy and nasty, but just taking walks. I would write through the mornings and take walks in the afternoon, and the walking. And I think because I was a skateboarder for much of my youth, and this was like pre-ollies, sidewalks to me are like I'm gliding along on a skateboard. And so I'm seeing kind of the cracks and the little corners and the little bits you would hit off of. And I think so walking was that for me when I was unable to
Yeah.
surf. The 6 or 10 foot wide sidewalk was the face of a wave, and I could kind of like slalom my way through it all. I guess it is very dancey, but I mean, it's kind of like you used the wonderful expression earlier of like sea legs, right?
Yeah.
That's almost a sea legs thing where you're taking this thing that you got from the water and you're bringing it to the terra firma. And I feel like I feel like much of my life is that, and I've often in pondering surfers and some of the great surfers, I've often thought like they're better in the ocean than they are on land. They're in this like weird amphibious sort of space. They're almost more sea people than they are like land people.
Yeah. Oh God, you just made me think of so many things. First of all, with the way you described walking through the city, seeing and
Hmm.
feeling and knowing how you would skate everything in a city, I can only imagine that sense of like game being brought
Hmm.
into it. And then you made me think of this other thing, which is I absolutely agree that you can see who someone is in life by the way they dance, by the way they move, by the way they hold themselves, by the way they surf. When you see a surfer that looks elegant, it's kind of mind blowing because it's such a powerhouse sport that when you see someone so strong, looks so I don't know, so full of beauty with the way that they move, it's really
Hmm.
like transcendent. It's really
Hmm.
pretty awesome to see. And then lastly, you talked about you made me think of this last phenomenon, which is I was just in Korea and I was researching all the stuff about the water there, so that show felt specific to that culture because there's such a great fishing culture there. And one of the really cool things that I was researching was this thing called Hyenyu, which is a sea lion woman. It's a culture that's been around, I think, since the 1600s, of these female free divers that dove in cotton up until the 70s, and they caught all of the seafood for this place called Jeju Island, which is a sought after, beautiful, beautiful island off the bottom of Korea. And it's this matrilineal niche of female deep sea divers that sing and whistle and catch
Hmm.
all the like food for the island. And it still goes on today. And most of them are in their golden years because the younger women want to do different things. But it's like a true sea lion woman. They're known as the
Wow.
protectors of the sea, and you can hear them singing around the coast. Like there's I don't know. I don't remember what it was you said, but you made me think about that.
Well, I think the thing, and I think you and I probably share this. I don't have the fishing component, but definitely have the surfing. But there's a way where like you just take the ocean with you wherever you go, and you take wave riding with you wherever you go, and it's sort of I hope that sense of play and those sort of askance angles that I might see as I'm riding along um, will translate or sort of seep over into the work that I do and have that movement
I think it does.
and flow.
Everything you've done, I've read, you can absolutely see a nimbleness and a agility in your writing that I think are words that I think of for surfing. And I think that has to be from that. You can't and as partly what I talk about with this sense of impatience and turbulence and stuff like that I'm seeing in these paintings. But with your writing, I really see this. Even if you're writing about surfing or not, it's how you're writing about it where I see the surfing, and that's what I was asking you
Mhm.
about before, which is this sense of. I think, I mean, you made me think of a few things. Outsiderness and this outsider syndrome that you have, I think, is at the very heart of the original, like the first heartbeats of surfing is an outsider
Mhm.
culture, and so that's like
Mhm.
both a beautiful and a very specific perspective to bring to the arts. Feeling like
Mhm.
you don't belong is is a beautiful place and also a difficult place, and I think that that's something that
Yeah.
people really connect to with your work, and I hope that they connect to with my work. But I think it's something that draws everybody into wanting to know what you're doing is that we all know that feeling, and so you're coming at it from a place
Mhm.
that's really universal and not snobby, and that's
Mhm.
just rare and beautiful.
No, that's such an interesting one, and I think that in something so big, so much bigger than ourselves, does that for sure. Um, and then the other side, and this is maybe I'm referring more to surfing than fishing, which is there's a kind of levity and a sense of play that can be a
Yeah.
wonderful thing to sort of incorporate into adulting.
I completely agree. I don't even know how to expound on that. I just try to just enjoy and like uh, relish. I think it's about like
Mm-hmm.
relishing every second.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think my final question for you is, what are you most excited about right now?
I just pushed these paintings to the level of knowing that this is the best body of work that I've ever created, and I actually have very rarely been able to share the work in New York. I've been painting in New York for decades, and I've been showing in Beijing and Geneva and LA and all around the world. But this will be the first time in a long time that I get to share the work with everybody here. And I feel like New York is such a painter's town, and we were talking about having a lot of faith in your viewers and in their eye, and knowing that they will read paintings in a way that's just at a different level. And so to
Mhm,
be able to share these works that I'm so excited about, and I was anxious. It's a lot of pressure to share the work with such a good painting town. And just in the last week, they got to the level where I knew it's going to be the best body of work I've ever created, and I just cannot wait to share them with everyone here. And so, yeah, I think that's the most exciting thing. The ballet's coming back together, and then I have this show at Pace Gallery, and yeah, I can't wait.
this is wonderful, and I so look forward to seeing this body of work you just described. That's
Thanks.
congratulations.
Oh, thank you. Thanks.
Kylie, thank you so much for the wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to talk to you.
Soundings is brought to you by the Surfer's Journal and is produced by me, Jamie Brisick, and Jonathan Shifflett. You can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. Our theme song is Give Me a Wave by Oscar Matsumiya and Paz Len Chanton. The Surfer's Journal is a reader-supported publication made possible by sponsorship from FCS, Finisterre, Howler Brothers, Outerknown, Patagonia, Rainbow Sandals, Vans, and Yeti. The journal is published bi-monthly. If you haven't done so yet, I encourage you to visit surfersjournal.com and subscribe. This episode of Soundings is presented by Costa Sunglasses, the badge of the explorer. For over 40 years and counting, Costa has remained steadfast in their dedication to not only crafting the most durable, functional, and long-lasting eyewear, but in protecting our waterways and natural resources. Whether you're on the back deck scanning for yellowtail, eyeing a set swinging wide at an empty point, camped out on a bluff at the end of a rotted two-track, or anywhere and everywhere in between, Costas are built to help you see what's out there. Head over to costadelmar.com today to find just the right pair for you, no matter where the water takes you. Thank you for listening to Soundings, and until next time.